Thank you for joining the first Epler Wood International Vlog. Today, we're going to cover the question of how is the media covering over tourism. It's a fascinating picture. The mainstream media is no longer dominating news coverage on travel and tourism. We're going to have Bret Love, the CEO of Green Travel Media, with us today. And in that interview, you're going to learn how much the bloggers and social media coverage is driving the agenda in the travel and tourism world. It's an important picture to watch. As we look at the growth of tourism worldwide, we may have less and less opportunity to actually see what I would call objective coverage of the question. Why is that? Because after all, a lot of the social media sphere and also the blogging sphere is covered by sponsorships, often from destinations themselves. Therefore, we're not really seeing an objective picture of how destinations can become more sustainable, because the overall agenda is to basically show the consumer how wonderful the destination is. So let's have a look at what Bret Love has to say about how over-tourism is being covered by the travel media. Thanks. Okay, welcome, Bret Love. You are the CEO of Green Travel Media and editor-in-chief and co-founder of Green Global Travel. Thanks for joining us for the first EWI vlog. Bret, how would you describe yourself and what you've been doing within the media?
Well, I've been a journalist for about 25 years now, but over the last 10 years, I've really focused on writing about the intersection between ecotourism and responsible travel, nature and wildlife conservation, and the preservation of indigenous cultures, because we really see those three things sort of intrinsically connected in terms of sustainable tourism.
Great, so you've had a chance to really observe a lot of how the media has changed over time. How would you describe the mainstream media's role in covering travel, both the industry and consumer choice?
Well, most of the publications that I've worked with and that I've read over the years tend to focus more on the consumer side of things. Those who do focus on the sort of business-facing side seem to be more interested in the mass tourism aspects of the industry, the cruises, the all-inclusives, the major developments that have millions and trillions of dollars at stake, as opposed to focusing on how to find solutions to the problems that we are currently facing in not just the tourism industry, but the world at large. So for me, the biggest challenge is that, you know, as a writer and as a reader, they don't really cover sustainable travel issues consistently. And when they do, they seem to me to be about 5 years behind tastemakers like yourself, if not longer, you know?
What do you think is the problem there? Do you think that basically they're assigned to consumer choice and never are assigned to industry?
I'm not really sure what it is. I mean, when I was a freelance writer, you know, working for a lot of major airline and hotel and other types of magazines around the world, you know, I would pitch them stories on responsible travel and elements of this type of tourism that we're talking about, and there just wasn't enough interest on behalf of the editors. It felt like they felt like it was too niche for them. And I think even now, you know, we're seeing these issues like over tourism and mass tourism that are starting to get more coverage from Washington Post and New York Times. But beyond those issues, I don't really see a lot of organizations that are willing to focus on this issue of how tourism and climate change and all of these things are sort of connected and how they're affecting destinations around the world. I think we will occasionally see things about the problems, but one of the things I'd like to see more of is media focusing on solutions and how we can actually improve things.
Right. How is social media affecting the change in travel and the type of coverage that we're seeing? What role is it playing, and how are the tourists really perceiving this social media by way of its independence?
Well, I mean, you know, social media in some ways is kind of the tail wagging the dog, you know, instead of people, really researching destinations and going and buying their, Lonely Planet guides or whatever they would use normally. They're really seeing these beautiful people in these beautiful destinations on Instagram. There's really not a lot of context, and it's more, oh, I want to go there and look like that in that place and get a picture of me doing that. So it becomes this thing where instead of looking for these immersive experiences, social media is creating these sort of shallow selfie opportunities that I think is leading people to travel in a different way, perhaps, than they traveled before the rise of Instagram and other forms. There are advantages. I mean, when I first started running Green Global Travel back in 2010, we were one of only two blogs that focused on responsible travel. Now we're in a group of responsible travel bloggers that has over 1,000 members. Would that community have come together without social media? I don't know. I can't say for sure, but probably not. And I think if there has been a positive, it's that it has given a broader voice for responsible travel and responsible sustainable tourism issues that might not have happened before social media came along. So it's giving rise to a lot of bad behaviors, but it's also allowing those of us who are interested in good behaviors to connect and unify and come up with strategies together.
Who's paying for this kind of media? And I think you mentioned a Brazil opportunity that really illustrated this. How independent can bloggers and Instagrammers be?
There is right this very minute, Brazil Tourism is actively trying to recruit bloggers, influencers, and journalists with major media outlets to come and do stories on tourism in the Amazon right now. Now, why would they be wanting to do that right now? Why would Brazil Tourism, a government-sponsored DMO, be trying to get people there? And I asked the guy specifically, I'm like, so you're going to sponsor these trips. Are you going to take them to see the good and the bad? Or are you just going to try to greenwash it and show the bad? So the problem I see is there are not a lot of DMOs, destination marketing organizations, tour operators. There's not a lot of, well, actually there are tour operators, but there's not a lot of DMOs and people with the big money behind them who are interested in bringing bloggers, influencers, journalists who are interested in really getting to the heart of sustainable travel. They're interested in people who will give very shallow, coverage that makes their destination look good. And so when these campaigns are happening, they are not inviting people like us. They are not funding people like us. The only people who are funding people like us are tour operators that are invested in a real sustainable travel ecotourism experience. And so it does create this imbalance where you have a lot of bloggers and influencers who are going to Sri Lanka, who are going to Kerala, who are going to all of these destinations that want to be seen as nature-friendly destinations, but these people are not getting the stories about what's really going on there. They're not trained in journalistic ethics or journalistic tools to tell the full truth of the story. And even when they are disclosing that it's sponsored, the audience that they're reaching out to are not the people who are going to care about, elephant abuse in Thailand or, what's going on behind the scenes in Sri Lanka and the, sort of political discord there, or what's happening to the indigenous leaders in the Amazon who are being murdered, to sort of make room for these farms and things. So again, there needs to be more disclosure, but there also needs to be exposure for the greenwashing that's going on left and right.
So in other words, the sponsorship is pointing you in the direction that a destination management organization wants you to see.
Exactly.
You have to finance your own trip otherwise.
Exactly. And that's pretty common for bloggers in general is, if you work with someone, they're expecting positive press. There have been many cases where we've gone and there have been negative things and we've written about them, or we've chosen not to write about a destination because we just didn't think it was a true ecotourism destination. That happens, but the bloggers who get invited on lots and lots and lots of press trips, that's not the way they do things. They tend to write the positive, fluffy.
Yeah. So this is not the media that many people are picturing exists out there. So with the over tourism, hitting the headlines the way it is, obviously that's a fairly negative story. Do travel writers and journalists have the information that they need and any sponsorships to write up these stories so that they can do it independently?
For us, it really comes down to finding the right partners to work with, finding partners that are truly invested in the ethos of ecotourism and conservation and responsible management of natural resources. For us, we try to work with tour operators or other entities that really understand what it is that we specifically do, which is really try to tell the story of the connection between conservation science, wildlife management, destination management, responsible tourism, and creating an actually resonant, transformative experience for the actual travelers. And finding that intersection can be difficult, especially if you're not trained as a journalist or don't really understand. I even had to train a lot of the bloggers that we work with because they thought ecotourism just meant nature travel. I'm like, ecotourism, you have to remember, eco doesn't just stand for ecology, it stands for economy. And if it's not benefiting both the ecology and the economy, it's not truly sustainable. So I think there is a willingness there on the parts of bloggers and journalists to get those stories, but I think there needs to be more training. And we've tried to do that through our talks at conferences and things like this that we do to sort of educate the younger generation on what's necessary, but we need more.
So do you think, going back to mainstream media now, do you think that they're equipped to do objective reporting on the industry and destinations in the future?
It's tough to say. I mean, there's such a consolidation of the industry right now. There's so many major publications going out of business. Every week there's a new one. Just, a week or two ago, Disney announced that with their acquisition of National Geographic, that National Geographic Traveler was going to be going away. And I mean, that's one of the biggest travel magazines in the world. So I think we're going to see fewer and fewer outlets. I think over time, they will have to cover these sorts of issues in some form or fashion if they want to stay relevant. But it still seems like such a small portion of their travel coverage that I feel like it really is falling on the independent journalists, the smaller niche outlets like EcoWatch and things like that, and the bloggers themselves and social media to really fill in the gaps of what the mainstream media coverage is providing, and looking not just at what are the problems that are happening in terms of over-tourism and other forms of unsustainable travel, but figuring out what are these solutions that the tourism industry can offer to make sure these destinations are sustainable long term.
Okay, thanks a lot, Bret, for this great interview on media and over tourism. We look forward to having more conversations about this in future on the EplerWood International Vlog. Thanks for joining us. This week we have a question sent via LinkedIn from Mr. Almeida from Portugal, who works in the travel and tourism industry in Brazil. He wants to know what role the media has in covering over tourism in Porto, Portugal, where locals are less and less able to afford to live there. He mentions the media is driving more interest in Porto and wants to know if their coverage might be harming the current situation. He asks, can they consider this problem, or are they just covering the next big stories? Great questions. All media coverage is driven by the news angles that may or may not consider what locals need and want. Travel media, more often than not, is simply covering the best places to travel. City leaders and national tourism offices do play a role in this. More often than not, destination management organizations, known as DMOs in the trade, may be paying for this type of coverage. This could be driving overtourism in overcrowded cities like Porto. DMOs will likely need to slow down media coverage in future and consider how to place more emphasis on protecting valuable historical cities throughout the world. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Epler Wood International Vlog.